I came from a finance background, and then I had the opportunities to learn that language. And then I spent time learning, how do venture capitalists in the world work? How did they make their money? And that allowed me to have a dialogue and understand, what are they worried about, and address their real concern. Being an entrepreneur means getting up learning curves. My biggest superpower as an entrepreneur and startup CEO is I learn fast. I learn all these technical domains we were talking earlier. How do you go into all these technical domains? Because I can sit down and learn enough, understand the core of those technical domains. Everything gets easier when the customers are dying for your product and want to give you money, throw money at you to get at it. And if you don't know how to do that, then you better be able to get people to come alongside you to help you figure that out. You've just got to have that insatiable curiosity to keep learning. Because if you're doing something new, that by definition means that you're going to have to go invent and learn about it from different angles. That's what makes it fun. If that's not fun for you, don't do this. That's really painful.
Totally hear that. Jen is a board director and experienced serial startup CEO, known for her insight, passion, integrity, and supportive leadership with over 35 years of diverse experiences. As a venture and angel-backed CEO, she has raised over $75 million from seed to Series C and led strategy, product development, commercialization, compensation strategy, and scale-up for breakthrough innovations. She has also achieved global sales and 10x revenue exits, fast FDA clearances, and has had multiple experiences in healthcare and life sciences to her credit. Jen is also a speaker, panelist, and a guest lecturer on startup best practices and writes her own blog. Now, here's Jen. Good afternoon, Jen. We're so excited to have you here with us today. I can't wait to jump in. You've had tremendous experiences, so welcome to Invisible Inc.
I'm happy to be here.
So you've got a tremendous breadth and depth of experiences across your entrepreneurship spectrum. What triggered this whole journey in the first place?
My interest in entrepreneurship, I think, started way back when I was in college. And I actually had an internship with a venture capital fund at that time. And it really solidified the idea that actually being in these small companies doing something innovative was super exciting. My undergraduate degree was organizational psychology at Michigan. And I got into this internship through some connections and ended up saying, gosh, I really love the business side of things. I also, as a high school student, had this crazy idea that I wanted to be a CEO someday, which is a longer story. So that was the beginning. However, at the time that I was in college, we didn't have entrepreneurship programs and all the kinds of things that they have today. And so I actually went and got my MBA, spent 3 years working in commercial banking, and then I spent 8 years in management consulting before I actually turned to entrepreneurship full time. And so that was basically in 2001. And I started on my journey, which is now ended up, I think I'm up to 7 startups that I've been, intensively involved in that 20-year period, including now where I have multiples.
Awesome. Can't wait to jump into the juicy details. So what is the one thing about entrepreneurship that keeps you going across all of these highs and lows, I presume?
I think the big thing that keeps me going about entrepreneurship is being able to make such a direct impact. When you work for big companies, and I work for Fortune 50 companies as a management consultant, as well as a large company in banking, you are such a tiny little cog in a really big wheel. In an entrepreneurial company, you are an integral part of making something happen. And I love that holistic view and the amount of impact that a single person can have on the outcome.
That's great. And that kind of triggers another question. When I was looking at your background, I noticed that you're both a founder and a co-founder, but you also joined other startups kind of after the founding had happened. What's different about the two, and what strikes you the most about the two?
I definitely have a propensity to like founding. And part of that is because I'm a little bit of a control freak, and I actually really like making sure all the pieces are in place. However, I have had multiple opportunities to come in, in a later stage when somebody else has founded. And the difference for me is the ability to control who is on the team. When I have come in later, I have been less happy about where the team is. And so for me, I keep trending back towards the actual act of founding because that allows me to actually figure out what is the right team, who are the right people, and get those people on. So that's been the biggest thing that's different between the two, but I've absolutely done both. And actually, currently, I'm coaching first time founders in a couple of instances and first time CEOs. And that is really fun, but obviously takes me one step removed from that, assemble my own team kind of thing.
Which is interesting because, obviously you don't get the team composition right, even if you are a founder versus kind of joining in late. How have you addressed that team mismatch or any missteps in hiring team members, especially when you were a founder? Just an aside, I was curious about.
Well, the team is what it takes to get things done. My track record's not perfect. I don't think anybody's is. But it's actually harder to change the team radically when you come in later than it is to build the team from the beginning. But I have absolutely had to part ways with co-founders and other team members along the journey. I don't usually have a lot of people turning over or leaving, but sometimes people aren't a good fit for where the company is growing. And a lot of times people don't have a really great understanding of what it means to become part of a entrepreneurial startup. It's hard to picture what that's going to be. And not everybody has the temperament for a true startup. Startups are hard and they're different from big organizations. And if you've grown up in a big organization, the transition can be really difficult. So I do look for people who've had previous startup experience when I'm trying to build teams, because that's usually, people temperamentally either like that level of risk, like that level of involvement, or don't. In big companies, oftentimes you have so many resources and your role is much narrower. It can be hard to adjust to startups where, everything you might have to do. And that is different for many people. Many people don't like it and they don't like the risk, or their families don't like the risk. Although I would argue that actually there's a lot of risk in being part of a big company too. So I think it's sometimes a false thing, but being a founder is a whole new level of risk that is different. When you're part of a big organization that has a revenue engine that's profitably making money every quarter, even if it's up and down a little bit, it's probably going to continue to pay your paycheck. Most startups don't succeed. Most startups go out of business, and most startups go out of business because they run out of money. And that means that as a founder, you are trying to do something, instantiate something that is very challenging. And startup companies are fragile things.
And that resonates because my career parallels almost one-on-one. I was in management consulting, so everything hits home and well spoken. So your point about the team triggered another thought, which is when I looked across kind of the startups you had founded, there's a pretty big proportion of STEM companies, and yet your background or your education is not in science no. So walk me through that. Like, how did that happen, and how did you acquire? What was the skill that you brought in, and how did you adjust to managing, I assume, much more technically proficient founders or employees?
Absolutely. So to be clear, I was an organizational psychology undergrad, and then I got a master's of management from Kellogg in finance and strategy. So I'm a business person kind of through and through, because as far as I'm concerned, organizational psychology was a lot about leadership. And so I'm all about the people and the business side of things. And yet, many times innovations are scientifically based or engineering based. And I think every startup, I'm looking at my little list here, that I've been involved in has had a scientific or technology base underneath it. Now, the reality is that I believe you actually need a team to build a startup. And I'm bringing kind of the business side of things, and I'm usually wrapping around a technical founder or founding team and helping translate the technology innovation that they have into actually a business. And that's essential component. One of the big challenges for many startups is they have a technical founder or a scientific founder who actually doesn't have those other skills. And that can be very difficult and actually one of the recipes for a startup failure. The advice for a technical or scientific founder is find somebody like me because you need that complementary skill set to actually successfully build a business.
And that resonates too. I work with quite a few technical founders, and there's always that chasm between the technology that they're in love with, which I get, and then there's the business side. So if there's one thing from all of your experiences, one piece of advice that you would give to a technical founder to bridge that gap or to even become more familiar, what would that be?
I think that the skills and the strengths that are required for somebody to be really innovative as a scientist or an engineer is a very different skill set than what is required to be successful as a business person or people person. And part of that is the level of precision and exactness required for that engineering and science. First off, if you're a technical founder, do you like the fuzzy people stuff where 80% answers are good enough? If you don't, then absolutely find somebody for whom that is and team up with them. If you actually like that kind of stuff, and there's a few people out there like that, then you can take over that role. But I don't think you can be both the technical scientific lead and the business lead at the same time. I really don't. I think if you are a technical person and you have both of those skills, you can choose which direction you want to be, but I don't think you can be both because actually the level of work, the level of precision, the level of exactness required to make the technology or science work, the switch over to doing the fuzzy stuff like fundraising, not that fundraising is fuzzy, but fundraising is very people, very sales. The mind switch is too great. So I've worked with experimental physicists. I've worked with, PhD engineers. I've worked with PhD scientists. And all of them, the demands of those technical disciplines are so great. They don't translate well. And you can't go from in the morning, I'm going to spend an hour doing this and then I'm going to do some sales and then I'm going to switch back because the level of concentration doesn't permit that. You really have to decide what hat do you want to wear and do you have the skills for that? And then find somebody else to do the complementary thing when you're talking about these technology-based high potential startups. We don't actually think it's a good idea to try to do both because while that may work for a tiny little bit of time, it's not going to work long term because the skill sets and the time devoted is different.
That's interesting. So then this brings this conundrum of a solo founder question, right? So there's this whole debate of one founder, two founders. I'm not going to step into that, but assuming that you are a solo founder for whatever reason, and you come from a technical background, what I'm hearing you say is, hey, pick one or the other and then hire to the other one. Does it always have to be a co-founder to the other one or is it?
No, I mean, it doesn't have to be. I have founded companies and been the founder and then, hired in the technical team. Usually I know who the technical team is but the solopreneur idea, actually, I wrote a blog post. I'm a blogger. I have a startup CEO reflections.com blog and I talked about solopreneurs on my last post and the fact that I don't actually think solopreneurs have an easy time raising money. And the reason is because it is so risky for investors. Investors who see lots of companies know how risky this is. So they may tolerate a solopreneur for a period of time at the very earliest stages. But frankly, a business is made up of people that execute that business. And so if you can't figure out how to make a team, then I don't think you actually are going to build a business. You may build an amazing technology. You may have a great invention, but an invention or a technology is not a business. And there is a need to be able to build a team. And if you can't build a team, then you aren't building a business. So I kind of think the whole idea of a solopreneur doesn't really fit with building a high potential business. There are plenty of people who have small consulting businesses, those kinds of things as one person shops. And so it's not that you can't ever do that. But if you're going to build a high potential business to a lot of revenue, you're going to need people who are out there hunting and selling. And you're going to need people who are making the technology and the science work. And you're going to need people who are dealing with the regulatory problems and dealing with the legal problems and dealing with the accounting problems. And all of those people are different skill sets. And you're going to have to bring all those pieces together. In fact, I was on LinkedIn with interacting with somebody who was responding to my post, and they were like, solopreneurs, look at this Silicon Valley guy who says solopreneurs, AI is going to make it possible. I'm like, I don't buy it, because AI doesn't solve the accounting problems. And if you're the guy that makes AI sing, you're probably not the accounting guy. And so, you may be the person who can make magic happen. And I've worked with some absolutely brilliant technologists, so brilliant. But every one of them didn't like that other business stuff. And so you're going to have to find somebody who likes that business stuff. And let's make no mistake about it. Fundraising is sales at root, at heart. It's finance, but it's sales. And if you don't like selling, and many technologists and scientists don't, then you're not going to do that well at fundraising. Even if you are profoundly passionate about your vision. Like I said, sometimes there's a little bit of fuzz at the very earliest stages for this. Sometimes people can raise, a few $100,000, but when you are trying to raise big money from large venture funds, you need to find somebody else or listen, because they're probably going to bring somebody else in.
Good point.
I'd rather be the one to find that person than actually have my investor impose them on me.
Very well said. So what become clear to me is, at the very least, if you can get them right away, you have a line of sight to parsing off each of those critical roles, business, regulatory, compliance, what have you, into separate people.
You don't need all of them at the beginning, but you need to realize that there are different skill sets, and you don't need every one of them at the beginning. 2 or 3 people as the founding team is plenty, but you're going to end up with 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 60, 100, 1,000. You're going to grow that team over time, and you're going to need different people with different skill sets. And actually, all that phase of growth requires different management skills. So that's just part of what it means to build a business. And so when you're thinking about these startups, are you trying to build a big business? If you are, there's going to be people, there's going to be technology, there's going to be market, there's going to be sales. All that stuff comes along with building a big, robust business. At the end of the day, you want to grow the business to the point where you, as the startup CEO, is actually dealing with the strategic issues and less of the day-to-day over time. That's not what's true when you're a 5-person startup, but it is absolutely true when you're a 50-person startup.
Yeah, great insights. So that brings me to the question, you talked earlier about figuring out what the technology is, great ideas and stuff like that. So as a founder, how do you evaluate whether something is worth risking all of this stuff like you talked about, pouring in your blood and tears and sweat? How do you make that evaluation, and how can you make it more objective rather than less for someone who's looking to take that plunge?
Yeah, the first most important thing is, what's the unmet need you're meeting, and how well does your solution meet that? And in every case, you've got to figure out an unmet need that is important. It can't be a casual unmet need. Now, understand, I don't build startups around games. I don't, there's a style of startup that I like to do, and they are high impact startups. And that means that somebody out there has got to have a point of pain that is burning them. And they're going to need, your solution has to address that point of pain. And they're probably doing something to address that point of pain already, or it's not that big of a point of pain. And so that's the first and foremost thing is, and my most successful startup, the first potential customer that we talked to and did customer discovery with, his reaction to the concept of what we were doing, we were planning to do, was, I don't believe you. When can I have one? Okay. And I don't believe you says, it's not been done before. I can't solve this problem. When can I have one? Is literally, I want to pay you to give me the solution because your solution would meet my need. And one of my more recent startups, the reaction was, this is holy grail territory. Okay. I want people talking about holy grails. I want people talking about, when can I have it? And immediately volunteering their help to get this product to them. if I'm getting kind of a, oh, that would be nice kind of reaction, that isn't strong enough. It needs to be strong. So that's the strength of that unmet need is number one point. The strength of the customer response to that. You've got to go out and talk to people who would buy this thing. You got to figure out who is that customer and talk to them. And I'm not talking to one or two of them. I'm talking 10s, 20s, 30s, 100 of them. And try and find people and have them literally be crawling across the desk saying, I need, and I want to be part of this. Another thing that's really important is thinking about what's the stage of development of your solution, technical or scientific. If it's just a concept, it's often very hard. And remember, I do venture-backed. I raise money. That's not the only way. In fact, if you can do it any other way, you probably should. But you don't want to go out and start raising money too soon. You want there to be a prototype. You want there to be some kind of evidence that your solution works and that people can react to it. There's a staging thing. And a lot of times, solutions that you can license out of the university aren't developed enough yet to justify a startup, although they're better than a napkin solution. You can go faster through the stages when you're talking about a strictly tech or IT play. But if it's got any hardware with it, you've got to have some stage development. Don't do it too soon. It's got to have plausible financials. Could I realistically sell it at $50,000 and make it for $15,000? Where's the margins going to, what does that look like? What's the price point that the need supports? And how much realistically can I make it for? And you've got to have some plausible solution that says, I can build this. The other piece is that how big is the market? I actually had one experience where there was a gastroenterologist, and this was for a pressure sensing catheter. And we were trying to get a grant. This is one of the earliest startups that I was involved in. And he got mad at me while I was trying to do the market analysis for this grant proposal. And he said, you have to understand, Jen, I know this is going to work, but none of my colleagues will agree with me. And I stopped and thought, wow, I have a market of one. Okay, you cannot have a market of one. I really learned a very powerful lesson in that moment. If I can't go find a number of people that would want to buy it, when I'm doing that customer discovery, it's a problem. Because I need to know that there's market, a significant market, that there's hundreds of people or thousands of people, depending on what the price point is. If you're selling a $50,000 product versus a $5 product, the number of people you need buying is different. But, you've got to figure out, can I build an organization to deliver this product? A lot of times, I know somebody who built a business and they could never get enough volume to keep themselves alive. I mean, they just starved for money, even though the product was pretty darn cool. There just wasn't enough way to access the market with the way they were delivering the product. And they ended up having to shut it down because they just could not make money doing this. At the end of the day, these are businesses. They need to make money. And you've got to have a line of sight to that.
So that brings up an interesting point, which is just earlier you said, I don't believe you can do it. When can I buy one? Which is that disbelief that it can be done. And on the other hand, it's a sign that it could be a market of one. So I'm sensing that the difference is that they didn't believe it, yet they wanted to buy it. Is the difference versus they didn't believe it, and then there was no order following it saying, can I buy one if you do, in fact, succeed?
Well, let's clarify that distinction. The person who said, I don't believe you, when can I have one? You could find thousands of same people. I mean, they were immunologists. Any immunologist wanted our product. In this other case, none of the other gastroenterologists, notice I've got a healthcare bias here, nobody else agreed that this solution would solve a problem they thought needed solving. So they were like, he thought this was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, but you talk to 5 other gastroenterologists, and they'd be like, why would you want that? So it was a question of, actually, this is a good point. One of the things that I'm looking for now, having done this enough times, I don't want the solution and the problem to be that obscure. Okay. So I worked on and joined a company that was doing turbine-free wind energy. It was a hard concept to explain. It was technically complicated, and you couldn't get people to sit still long enough to listen to all the nuances to understand it, which is a problem for fundraising and a problem for selling. So I now look for problems that people go, you can describe the problem in a few words. And people go, oh, yeah, that's a problem. And then you can describe the solution in a few words. And if it's much more complicated than that, it takes you 10 or 15 minutes to explain. You're going to be giving 5 or 10-minute pitches of this to customers, to potential investors. You don't have time. And if it is that complicated, it's very hard to fundraise for and it's very hard to sell. So I do now look for a certain amount of intuitiveness. Now, it needs to be intuitive to the customer that you're talking to. We were working on a product that had to do with hemodynamic instability, which is, how the blood flow in your body works. There's this thing called shock, which is when your kind of body shuts down. If you talk to a doctor and you say, our thing can detect the signs of shock hours earlier than anything else, doctors go, oh, A, they know what the signs of shock are. B, they know it's hard to detect in advance. And they know it kills people. So if you can say that to the right person who is a buyer, they're interested in that and they get it. Now, it doesn't mean that you or I and all of our listeners who don't live in that space need to get it. It's the people that you're targeting need to be able to get it. And they need to be able to say, oh, that's holy grail territory if you can do that. And that's what they did. So it's that kind of thing where you're looking for something that makes sense to your target market. It doesn't have to make sense to somebody who's not in your target market, quite frankly.
Which is a great point. So I'm going to extend that same example and say, now you've got your 5 doctors who are all excited about your shock solution, right? But you're talking to investors who are not necessarily experts in that. So how do you translate that excitement? Is it just saying, I've talked to 5 doctors who are in XYZ specialty and all 5 of them are dying to buy? Or how do you communicate that excitement?
How do you
that?
get that evidence that the investors are going to need? And that's actually a really important part of forming a company. And by the way, it matters. 5 is good, but you're going to need 25 or 50 of them before you have enough evidence.
Good point.
I personally take great notes when I'm actually interviewing people. I write up all of those notes. I extract pithy quotes from those notes. I share the pithy quotes, and then I have the backup of all the detail of what somebody said so that I'm actually doing that customer discovery and making it accessible to the investors. So first, you've got to be able to describe it in terms that investors will understand. But you do need to realize that investors look at this differently. Investors will assume, at least for a while, that your solution actually works. So you can declare, I have this solution and it works, and investors will give you the benefit of the doubt for a while. But first, they have to understand what's the problem, and they have to believe or be able to get their head wrapped around it enough to be like, yeah, I can see why that's a problem. And sometimes that means, is there a third party? Does the CDC think it's a problem? Is it something that they've heard of? I'm working with a startup right now that tries to reduce the risk of healthcare-associated infections, or HAIs. Lots of people have heard of HAIs. We understand that if you get an infection when you're in the hospital, it's a problem. Many people know that the hospital doesn't get paid if they have to fix a problem that they caused, like a hospital-acquired infection. So these are the kinds of things where you can talk about something that investors can relate to, or they've had somebody experience, and they'll be like, yeah, that's a real problem. And then you say, and our solution is what the solution is. And then they will save for later kind of proving out that the solution actually works. And by the way, the best way to prove out that the solution actually works is to have customers that are buying it, or to have customers that are indicating that they're going to buy it, or having interviews from customers who've tested it if you can't get to that point. Because if you have to go through a regulatory process, you may not be able to get there. But you're trying to provide evidence that your problem is real, your problem is significant, and your solution works. But a lot of times founders want to prove my solution works and do all kind of the technical proofs. That's actually a later stage thing, later stage in the fundraising process. The first splash is, do I understand the problem? Do I believe that the problem is big? Do I think this business could be big? And I'm going to assume that you have actually figured out a solution that works. And then later in the due diligence process, there'll be some stress testing of, does the solution actually work? But the best way to prove that is to have a customer or a beta tester or somebody like that who looks like your future customer be able to say to the investor, this solution works. I've used it.
Before we dive back into our conversation, I want to tell you about Seed to Success. Seed to Success is our community letter with our proprietary insights on startup financial storytelling, tips, new episodes, and much more. If you find these discussions helpful in your entrepreneurial journey, use the link in the description to subscribe to Seed to Success today and get all of these and much more straight to your inbox every week. Now, back to our conversation. Awesome. Which brings us to the whole big question of fundraising, right? So you've been through the grind many times. So can you give us like a 101 on what are the basic things a founder needs to have in place before she goes out for her first outside raise, be it angels or investors? Just give us a primer on that.
Yeah, I think fundraising is hard. It takes vastly more work than most people realize. And that work competes with building the business. And so for a founder, it can be half your available time. And by the way, your available time is like every waking hour. And so I've occasionally had people say, well, I talked to 5 investors and I couldn't get there. Well, when you talk to 100 investors and you couldn't get there, then I'm going to believe you worked hard enough. Because I've raised 75 million for a number of different startups, and 100, investor touches is not unusual at all in the process of raising money.
For one raise.
So, for one raise, for one round. I mean, it gets easier as you get more established and later stage because there's more evidence and you're talking to people with bigger checks. But it is not unusual at all to have to talk to many people. And I think many times founders think it's going to be a whole lot easier. Oh, I got a meeting with one of my first-time CEOs that I'm coaching right now sent me a note over the weekend, and he's so excited. He's like, I heard this investor speak. They'd be great. And I'm like, they may be great when we're ready to raise money, which we're not yet. However, I think he thinks it would be go talk to them and boom, they give us money. Then it's probably not going to be that simple. It's probably going to be, we're going to talk to dozens of people. And most of them are going to say no. And so that's part of the whole fundraising process is how difficult that is. Now, first question, please ask yourself, please try really hard. A lot of people are like, oh, they need to get a paycheck, therefore I need to go raise money. Trust me, that is not a reason that investors care about. Okay. The reality is they want to know, do you need money to build this business to be a gigantic high impact business? And if you are not building a gigantic high impact business, then that's not going to be interesting to them. So what the things that you have to do ahead of time, and by the way, this takes 9 to 12 months minimum in my experience, is you've got to go out there, do all that customer discovery, collect all that customer data, build some prototypes of your solution to demonstrate that the key technical risks have been mitigated. Figure out what's the business plan, what's the financial model, what's the pricing model. All of those planning elements that say, I actually have a reasonable business are necessary before you ever go talk to potential investors. And investors are going to be looking at how strong is that point of P? How good and innovative is that solution? If it's not radically better than what they have available to them right now, then why would somebody buy it? What evidence do you have that somebody buy it? What financial models can you build that show that this can be a big business with a big market? What financial model can you show that shows that you actually know what are all the pieces that you need? All of that stuff requires time and work and evidence gathering before you go out and start fundraising. And then you're going to be looking for and figuring out what the right size round is. Oh my goodness. I think in the last 18 months, I have spent more time with first-time founders helping them figure out what the right size round is. And a lot of times it's like, well, I can only raise this much. Okay, that's a start. But I've actually had a couple of people where I'm like, look, if you raise that much, you are in no man's land because it doesn't allow you to get to the milestone that you need to get to. And it's not enough. And so you've got to figure out a way to raise more. Or you've got to be willing to take this chunk, accomplish these things, and then go raise again. People have this way of fuzzily kind of getting, well, everybody raises 500,000. Well, guess what? 500,000 is probably not enough. And if you can only raise 500,000, what the heck are you going to accomplish with that? I mean, you better be able to accomplish something really major to justify raising a few million the next time. And there are stages, and you've got to kind of be able to fit in the boxes of that investors are expecting, because investors are cruising through lots of options. You are competing against so many other companies, and that's what makes fundraising really hard, is that you're very focused on your problem, your solution, but investors are looking at it like a big marketplace of, it's like a smorgasbord of all these different things that they can do. And they want to say, that one looks really tasty and that one not so tasty.
You bring up a fascinating point, right? There's this 3-point puzzle that you have to solve. On the one hand, you have the industry and it has its own cadence. Like, for example, if you're in medtech versus, pharma versus software, the size and timing of the rounds are very different, right? Because how much you need to invest in it. So there's an industry factor. And then there's a financial modeling factor, which is how accurate is your picture that you painted of how much money you'll need, right? And then there's what the market, irrespective of the industry, is at today. Is it a good market? Is it a risk on or a risk off market? Can you talk first about financial modeling and what would you recommend that is the bare minimum a founder needs to have before she goes out and tries to raise money?
I'm not a great commenter on that because I came to this space with a lot more finance in my background than most. I started out as a teenager loving to read personal finance books. It's a little weird. I admit it. I'm a little weird, but I did. I started there. I went and I got a finance degree. I worked in banking and then management consulting, which is all about financial models. Okay. So I did all of those things. So by the time I started my entrepreneurial career, I had strong financial modeling skills, a strong understanding of accounting and financial statements, and a strong understanding of how that translates into a business and how you build a financial model around that. Does everybody need to have all of those degrees? No, probably not. But the CEO and founder of a company is expected to understand the financial underpinnings. And you better understand that. And then that may be something that you need to find a way to learn about it and to be conversant in all this terminology. And honestly, some of that is what I'm bringing to the table to these startups that I'm advising, because the founders are more technical or more scientific or more domain specific, and they don't necessarily have all of that skill set. So you can find somebody like me, somebody like an advisor to help with this. But at the end of the day, you need to be conversant in it. I was on the call earlier this week with a VC that had asked me to be involved in talking to one of their potential investments. And then we were having a debrief afterwards. And the comment that was, they kind of have a weak financial model. Biggest challenge, they've got a really interesting solution. They've made huge amounts of traction. They've got a very technical founder and co-founder. And the problem is that it's not clear, whether they have kind of the right stuff to be venture backed. And I said, I think they can learn a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that was a demerit for them was the strength of their financial model. It was oversimplistic. I have a quite robust financial model that I end up working with. And I can tell you that you shut down that whole question mark when you have a really robust, strong financial model. I got to the point where it's like, well, let me send you a copy of our financial model. And that was the end of the questions because people were like, oh, they do know what they're doing. And that was the end of it. Whereas this conversation was, I'm not sure they know what they're doing because that's really on display when you don't have a grasp on their financial model. When you don't have a grasp on how the finances work together. I think this is one of the learning curves. Being an entrepreneur means getting up learning curves. My biggest superpower as an entrepreneur and startup CEO is I learn fast. And I learn all these technical domains. We were talking earlier. How do you go into all these technical domains? Because I can sit down and learn enough, understand the core of those technical domains and understand how it translates and to go out and gather information from the market, to gather information from the technology, to know how to bridge and translate that as a business and understand those things. On the financial side of a business, you need to have that skill set. Now, I also like to have a director or CFO or finance type of person on my team. I'm terribly, it's the worst thing in the world to actually do the accounting for me. I have really good finance and accounting instincts, but I hate making sure that the checking account balance is at the end of the month. I'm horrible at it. I'm really bad. So I need somebody that loves that kind of stuff, loves to chase that last penny. But I need to know, what are the levers? How does that translate? How do I talk about things like revenue, cost of sales, cost of service, gross margin, knowing that sales and marketing comes below the line? I mean, you've got to learn these accounting concepts. You've got to be able to justify and talk about that. Because investors expect that if you can't do it, then you're not the right person to be running the company. Because fundamentally, the leadership of a company needs to be worried about and thinking about the finances. And how does that look like?
The one thing that I will ask you on that specific company is, do you see it where it could be a potential deterrent, where everything else looks good, but we're so not sure of the financials that we would rather say no?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I literally think that was the question that is going to get a little more attention. And sometimes the investors will try and redo the financial model, where they'll build their own financial model. The problem is they don't actually usually have enough information to do a great job of it, but they will build a competing financial model. So at the end of the day, investors are investing in the leader/management team, leaders, plural or leader singular, of the company. And this is a skill that needs to be strongly in evidence. Or they don't want to give you thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, because if you haven't demonstrated that you don't understand the money side of things, I'd rather give my money to a team that can.
And there's no other competitors, right, for that money.
Yeah, there's so many competitors. And if you raise money and you haven't filled in, there's a little bit of grace at the earliest stage before you raise any money. But after that, and by the way, you can be much more impactful if you can show that, hey, I'm a startup CEO and I'm asking you for money. Please give me your money. You can trust me with it. Showing that I understand the finances is one element of helping them learn to trust me. There's lots of questions that have to be answered in that trust transaction, but it's a trust transaction and it's about money. And financial plans are a money thing. And you have to understand, how much money do I need? Where does it go? What are the terms of the investment? Do I understand it? Can I coherently talk about the terms of the investment? And that means spending time as a founder and understanding who are those investors and how do they think about the problem. And I am seeing, oh my goodness, so many first-time founders, first-time startup CEOs who can't talk about the money and they don't understand how investors think about it, and they don't think it's important. They think, I will tell them my story about my product and how important it is and my customers and how that this has, is $1 billion business. But if they don't spend time figuring out what is a VC about, then they will have a really hard time having that conversation with a VC because they don't understand their language. And you have to learn their language and you have to be able to comprehend it. And I was lucky. I came from a finance background, and then I had the opportunities to learn that language. And then I spent time learning, how do venture capitalists world work? How do they make their money? And that allowed me to have a dialogue and understand, what are they worried about, and address their real concern. And I see founders that are busy people trying to solve all the problems, and they don't spend the time or think it's worth their time to understand this other market, which is the investors, and they need to solve.
Which is a really important point. So given that there is this competition and this demand for so many things right upon a founder's time, what would you recommend as a simple, effective way to get up to speed on how an investor or a VC thinks, especially somebody who's not financial like you are?
I don't know if there's a simple way. You have to understand the essence of financial statements and how they get built. You have to understand management accounting and how it gets built. And then you have to understand venture capital and how venture capital makes money. I mean, you have to understand the portfolio effects that venture capitalists, the fact that they typically have a 10-year time horizon, and that they're deploying capital, they're building, and then they're returning capital, and that all of those things affect what kinds of investments they're willing to make. I write about a lot of this stuff on my blog because trying to help people like grasp the dynamics that are there. You know, I've run into so many people who do not understand the fundamental fact that a venture capitalist who has raised money from limited partners, they have a contract, an agreement with those limited partners about what they're going to invest in. If you're too far outside the circle of what they've agreed they're going to invest in, they're not going to invest in you. It doesn't matter if they personally like you. They've got an agreement with the people who gave them money because they have a fiduciary responsibility to those people. And they've agreed on what the box is that they're going to be investing in. And their investors do not want them going wildly outside of that box. So if I've agreed that this is a healthcare fund, I am not going to be investing in climate tech, unless it's healthcare and climate tech. But, you know, it needs to check certain boxes. This is a classic one. People are like, I've heard of this gigantic Silicon Valley fund that has $1 billion under management. Okay, if you're raising $500,000, do not go chasing $1 billion funds. Why? Because it doesn't make any sense for $1 billion fund. They can't write checks that small logistically. So don't chase them. I've had this debate with founders who are like, how can I not go after Kleiner Perkins? It's because Kleiner Perkins is never going to invest in a company of this size at this stage. Look at what they're investing in. They need to put 50 or $100 million to work per company. And you're talking about raising 500,000. It is a waste of their time. You've got to understand, they've got a $500 million fund and they're going to try and make 20 investments in it. So 500 million divided by 20 is how much money per company? And okay, we're going to do a third of it is our first investment, or maybe 50%. So you got to be able to do that math and say, is this company, is this fund, am I ever going to fit inside what they're looking for? And if you're not, then don't waste your time, because your time is your most precious resource.
Got it. And I'm going to ask you one last question on this before we conclude. And that is, you talked about the size of the round and how important it is to get that right. Can you just give an overview of how to do that right for a first-time founder who's never done it before?
Yeah. Understand that there are a couple of factors going into what's the right size of round. There are some market norms that you just should be aware of. You know, if you're raising 2 million or less, you're in a seed, pre-seed type of stage. Series A is probably going to be more. There are some norms and some bands that you just need to be cognizant of. But you also need to figure out what's the minimum amount you need, round it up, to get to the next milestone. Because the purpose of the money you're going to raise is to reduce the risk. So I need $500,000 to get my first prototype built that I can actually get out into and get some market feedback on. There was a company that I was working with or am working with that needed to invest in some automation. They were raising $1 million, but the automation cost $1.5 million. So they weren't going to be able to invest in that. And I'm like, wait a minute, why are you raising $1 million? Well, because everybody has to raise $1 million. No. What do you need to accomplish the thing it is that you need that's the next step? I talked to, this was like a year ago, this great company that, they were trying to raise 500,000, and then in 6 months they were going to raise another $1 million. And I'm like, you don't have time. You don't have time to raise 500,000, do anything meaningful, and then raise another $1 million. So you actually need to raise like $2 million right now. Now you can tranche it so that everything's committed. So you don't have that fundraising time frame and say, we're going to take the first part and we're going to take the first $1 million. We're going to say $2 million. We're going to take the first $1 million and we're going to do this. And then when we accomplish that objective, you're going to give us the second $1 million, and then we're going to go do that. You can do that. But notice that raising 500,000 puts them in this no man's land if they don't get anything done. It's just a little bit of money in the bank and they fail to do anything with it because it's not enough to do the thing that is measurable. So you've got to decide, what is the thing that's measurable? What's the next thing that's meaningful? By the way, that you need to get a little bit of feedback from investors on as to what they would consider meaningful. Sometimes what we consider meaningful is just a little bit of a step, and it needs to be substantially de-risking. It needs to show that the technology really works. How do you prove that? It needs to show that some small set of customers will actually buy it. It needs to be something that's de-risking the business. And how much money do you actually need to do that? Now, there is a tug and play here. If I think that this company is going to take $10 million all in, I probably don't want to raise all $10 million at the earliest stage. It's probably better for me to take a smaller amount, say $2 million, raise that, accomplish some things, and then raise the next chunk at a higher valuation. That actually preserves more for the founding team and the earliest investors if you do it in stages like that, which is why rounds of funding are normal because of that dynamic. But you've got to figure out what's that next thing. We talked a little bit about sometimes shutting down a business. One of the businesses that I had to shut down, actually, I reached the point of not deciding to shut it down when essentially the market moved substantially and wiped out a 50% market advantage that we had in terms of cost. So they essentially made the competing technology as inexpensive as ours was. And we thought we had a 50% cost advantage, and then we had a zero cost advantage. Okay, so that made it really hard to convince customers to take a risk on a new technology when they had an existing technology at the same thing. So I wiped that out. That meant they couldn't raise. And everything about the next milestone kept having to shrink. And there was a whole bunch of factors that went into that. And some of them were technical. But at the end of the day, it became obvious to me that the amount of money that I needed to raise wouldn't actually accomplish a milestone that was meaningful enough for me to be able to raise again. And we were just not going to be able to do it. And at the same time, we were going to be putting people's lives at risk. And so at the end of the day, I had to argue with our investors to shut the company down because we had lost our market advantage. We'd lost our reason for being. We had no new technology innovations to recover that. And we couldn't raise enough money to do a big enough milestone for a material difference in de-risking. And so we could have done perfect. With the milestone that we could afford to do, we could have done absolutely everything perfect, and it wouldn't have been enough to de-risk the business. And that's why at the end of the day, I had to be like, you know what? This business is done. This business doesn't make any sense anymore. That was after 8 years. But we did need to get to the point where it's like, this doesn't make any sense. And I had to argue with a lot of people to convince them that you need to see that clearly. And it's the inverse when you're thinking about how do you fundraise. Can I build enough with this amount of money? And you've got to have, you've got to expect that you can't perfectly see what your costs are. So if you can line item your costs out and you've got $250,000 in costs, you better be raising like 300 or 400 million, 400,000, because you've got to accomplish that thing. And then you need time to actually raise the next round. And you also need some squish because there's things you haven't thought of that are going to cost you money. That's the trick of round sizing.
Which it is fascinating because I picked up a few threads here that I want to just play back to you. Number one is you got to be very clear what a milestone is. And the new part to me was that sometimes that milestone might be bad news, is that you shouldn't be going after it, to your example. Then once you get the milestone, what I heard is you need to make sure that's actually something that will excite investors enough to say, okay, I'll buy that milestone from you by funding this round. Right?
Great way to put it.
And then you need to be very clear about, I have a very good idea. So back to our financial modeling, right? It's 300,000. I can't just spitball it and say, oh, I think it's going to cost about, I don't know, marketing, maybe 100 grand. You can't do that because it's just not going to play off as kind of the third message I heard. And you get all of these together and then you kind of bake in the market, where you are with investors, what the competition is for the investment funds. And then you come up with this magical number that presumably will get you to a meaningful place that, without giving up too much of your equity. Is that a good characterization of?
I think that's a really nice summary. And you have to be prepared if you're going to raise money to share the benefits. You have to be willing to give up and share the future benefits of the company. I see some people like, I want to maintain control. Trust me, if you raise money from outside investors, you do not have control, even if you have 51%.
Got it.
So
say more about
that. You've got to be like, I can make the pie bigger, and keep your eye on that prize of making the pie bigger, that everybody succeeds together is how you have to think about it. And you have to believe that you can take this amount of invested cash and multiply the value of that. And if you can't, don't raise money. Go do something else.
Got it. So then this has been a fascinating conversation. So to wrap up, right, if I had to ask you, you're talking to a first-time founder, she's never raised funds before. What would be the top 3 things or 5 things that you would recommend she start doing Monday morning so she can improve her odds of building a successfully, invested company?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, if you haven't raised money before and you're just starting down this path, know yourself. Really think about, is this what I want to do? There are less risky ways to get a paycheck than building a company. Okay? Most companies fail. And you need to be careful how much of your money you put at risk. And you need to have the temperament, and your spouse, family needs to have the temperament to be willing to get into this stuff. It's going to be long term. If you can't see yourself doing this for the next 5 or 10 years, if you're not motivated enough to solve it, I wish it was shorter. I wish it was, the clips were like this. They're not. They never are. I should say never. There's probably, I know there are counter examples to that, but it's so rare to be successful. Like 90% of startups fail. It's like 0.000 become unicorns, which is $1 billion valuation startup. So you really got to be motivated by something other than, oh, this is a great way for me to make lots of money. I hope your motivation, and this is what you want to check, is I really just need to solve this problem, because that's what's going to get you up and motivated every day. And then you need to start building the team. If you're going to be the founder, your leadership skills and characteristics are under evaluation, because the team is one of the most important factors for investors. And if you're going to be the leader of that team, a leader is defined by how many and who you can get to follow you. And that is customers, that's investors, that's team members, everybody. If you can't lead well enough to get people going along with you, you are not the right leader for that company. And then you just need to start understanding your market, understanding how strong the pull is. I think you have to focus your time and attention on who's your customer and understanding what their needs are, because it's so easy to say, I have a new mousetrap, and you need to make sure your mousetrap is really attractive to the mice. Yeah. Oh, and they better go figure out what the mice think's important. Do they think cheese or peanut butter is better? I don't know. But if you aren't making something, building a better mousetrap, you better make sure it's better in a really important way. I had a startup that I was talking to, and I knew the market space that they were in, and they had like not enough improvement on the status quo of other companies. And I'm like, you guys, nobody is going to care about your solution. Yes. And with this one dimension, you're better, but it's not even an important dimension. It's kind of like a minimally important dimension. So yeah, it's better, but nobody's going to care. And it's so hard. And by the way, those other companies that you're going to be competing with are advancing their solutions already. So you really got to find and define that market space, and then realize that investors aren't going to necessarily appreciate it. So I really do think it comes back to know yourself. Are you really cut out to do this? Most people aren't. Know your market, know your solution really well. Is it really important? Because everything gets easier when the customers are dying for your product and want to give you money, throw money at you to get at it. And then you have to do all the blocking and tackling with figuring out how to build a business. And if you don't know how to do that, then you better be able to get people to come alongside you to help you figure that out. And they're learning all the time. The world of being an entrepreneur is a hypothetical entrepreneur is not for the faint of heart. And there are easier ways to get a paycheck. But there are not necessarily easier ways to have a huge impact on other people. It is worth doing, and I would not do it. I still am attracted to the whole process of it. But it's not because it's easy. And my husband laughs at me because he's been with me since high school. And he's like, you can't stand to not be doing this kind of stuff. And he's right. But the very fact that I can't really, I'm useless for doing much else is what makes me good at being able to do this and kind of building all the skill sets, because it is a wide and diverse set of skills that you need. And you have to be interested in learning all that stuff, learn all the time. So you just have to start learning. And there's lots written. You're listening to this podcast, which is shows an interest. That's one of the ways that you learn is you listen to people like us talking about this stuff, and you start picking up and you read things like my blog or other solutions to try and be learning all those things. But you can't be myopic. I mean, the founder and leader of a company has to learn lots of the pieces. And you don't have to know, you have to know broad. And in some areas you have to go deep.
The T-shape, right? One deep and multiple.
Yeah, the T-shape. But you've got to be interested enough to learn, all kinds of new things. At every startup that I've been part of, I have learned all kinds of new things about a new industry, a new function, a new technology. And you've just got to have that insatiable curiosity to keep learning. Because if you're doing something new, that by definition means that you're going to have to go invent and learn about it from different angles. That's what makes it fun. If that's not fun for you, don't do this. That's really painful.
Totally hear that. So this has been an amazing conversation, Jen. I really appreciate you taking the time. I learned a ton. I got a lot of nuances, and I have no doubt that our founders will learn a ton as well. So thank you so much. Absolutely. It's been fun. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been very fun for me too. Good luck.
Thank you. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you for tuning in. If you find these conversations helpful in your own journey, please subscribe to Seed to Success, our weekly community letter with tips, insights, resources, and more. If you have any other questions relating to startup finance or financial storytelling, send them over to me at chakras@achieve.co. That's chakras@achiiv.co. We'll see you on the next episode of Invisible Ink. Now, go achieve.